McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the dish with one spoon agreement. And so I think that's important, not only for for Indigenous settler relations in Canada, but obviously for the land is important to our discussion here today too. So, welcome to the Narratives of War project, which is a virtual exhibit that has so far collected over 1,500 Ukrainian civilian testimonies of experiences of war between May 2022 and now. And we have a fairly full agenda, and so I don't want to take up too much time. My name is Victor Satzewich. I'm a professor of sociology at McMaster, and Professor Kuperman and his team have asked me to moderate this event, and I'm really honored to have been asked and to be able to take part. I wanted to thank a few people. Dr. Maxime Deschenais, who is the research project manager at ARiEAL, the Center for Advanced Research in Experimental and Applied Linguistics. I think I've only met Max recently, but I think he did a lot of the background preparation for this and help with that, so I certainly appreciate that. Also wanted to, on behalf of the project team, thank the McMaster Library, the Offices of International Affairs, Alumni, and Advancement for their support for this really important project and event. And finally, I wanted to kind of thank and acknowledge Daria Teraby, who's she's a student at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. She came to Canada, not even a month ago, 3 weeks ago, under the MyTax program. So MyTax was able to, I was able to recruit Daria for some of the things I've been working on, and Daria has very kindly lent some of her time to this project, and so wanted to acknowledge that. So the agenda for today, for this evening, is there's two kind of components to it. So the first part will take 35 or maybe 40 minutes at the beginning, and I'm going to introduce the various players and team members that have been part of this project, and they're going to say a few things about how they can have connected to and engage with the project. And then after that, we'll have kind of a panel discussion, and we'll open it up. So I have a few questions that I've kind of thought about and prepared in advance, but we also want this to be engaging, and so we'll open it up to the audience as well. So that's basically the way it's going to be structured. Max tells us we have a pretty hard deadline of 7:45, 7:50 kind of thing. So we will keep our eye on the time. So without any further ado, let me first introduce Dr. Victor Kuperman. He is the professor in the Department of Linguistics and Languages, obviously at McMaster. He's also the Canada Research Chair in Psycholinguistics, and he's a member of the Center for Advanced Research in Experimental and Applied Linguistics, ARiEAL. And he showed me his lab the other day. It's pretty darn impressive. So.
Thank you so much, Victor, and thank you for coming. This event and this project, Narratives of War, is about stories and storytellers. And so we all thought that it would be appropriate for each of us to begin with a story of how we joined the project and what it means for us. I'll start with mine. About 500 days ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. the shock and the outrage from this criminal act and the unending news of death and loss and violence made it impossible for me to stand on the sidelines. Like many of us here in the audience, I contributed to the cause as a private person, but I was also thinking, what can I do in a professional capacity? As a linguist, as a language researcher, as a university professor in Canada. And two ways emerged. One was to invite and host Ukrainian scholars and students at McMaster. Together with my colleague in the ARiEAL Center, Volyn and several others, we listed our labs in the worldwide list of groups that were open to receiving Ukrainian scholars. For the longest time, we were the only language researchers on that list. And so this is how the contact was made by many of the scholars that ended up coming to McMaster, coming to the ARiEAL Center, and you will meet them today, many of them, and hear their stories as well. We ended up putting together ARiEAL resources and McMaster financial help. We were able to receive 4 Ukrainian colleagues, 2 professors and 2 students. They now continue their studies and work at McMaster. Another way of helping the cause stemmed from my earlier work on the history of history of the Holocaust. Catastrophic events like the ongoing war are known to bring psychological trauma to millions of survivors, the trauma that can carry over multiple generations. Yet most survivors of the war never voice their experiences. And if they do either in the family circle or many decades later in a more remote and distanced way. So this holds true for memoirs of survivors, their after-war interviews, written testimonies in the court of law, and so on. So even when journalists report on the ongoing warfare, the quotes that we get in those interviews are given through the lens of a reporter. What this means for those of us who observe the war from afar and for future generations is that the personal experience of war is often given to us indirectly or through the veil of reflection and self-censorship. The idea was then to collect first-hand accounts of the war experiences as they happen during the ongoing conflict. Hence the acronym of the narratives of war, NOW. I will start running some stories in the background. They are taken from different regions of Ukraine, and these are just fragments, small fragments of the actual stories that you can find in the virtual exhibit. 2 goals were equally important to us: to create the historical record of Russia's invasion, as seen by Ukrainian civilians, and to make it public and as visible and accessible as possible. We believe that making people's testimonies heard in all their rawness and immediacy is the way to raise global awareness of the devastating impact that the war has on Ukrainians and to fight misinformation and disinformation and apathy. In time, when Ukraine wins the war, these stories will help overcome the psychological trauma of the war and bring the healing of the Ukrainian nation and people. I was lucky that I could develop this vision together with a team of amazing researchers from Ukraine, who frankly have so much more experience in this line of research. The clinical psychologist, Dr. Larysa Zasiekina, is with us, a distinguished visitor from Ukraine, and the linguist, Dr. Satzewich, who unfortunately could not make it here. They're both from Lesya, Ukrainka, Volyn National University. And from our conversations, from probing our way in the dark almost, this is how the project was born. Some 7 short weeks after Russia's invasion, we already set up our study online and began the data collection. We asked people in the most open-ended way to describe their experience of war, and we asked some additional questions that gave us context demographically, geographically, and psychologically. Dr. Larysa Zasiekina will share details of this later on. Once we opened the data collection, written testimonies came in like a flood. As of today, we have over 1,500 narratives of war from all regions of Ukraine, from all ages, people who were displaced internally or had to forcibly migrate, or those who stayed in their home. It took an effort of a small army of dedicated volunteers from McMaster students, staff and faculty, as well as Hamilton community to process these texts and make them into an openly accessible collection. Dr. Myron will talk about this process very soon. The Narratives of War virtual exhibit presents these narratives to you as they came to us, in languages of Ukraine and in English translation. Olga Dvorova will walk you through the structure and content of the resource. The virtual exhibit and the materials are hosted by the McMaster Library and Archives. You will hear more about long-term preservation of these historical documents and about their meaning for the historical record from Myron. Besides collecting and publishing the narratives, we analyze them. This is where our linguistic chops kick in. As linguists, we know that language is capable of reflecting people's thoughts, emotions, beliefs, perhaps even more than people realize. The narratives that we present are very rich in detail and give us, as researchers, an incredible insight into the psychological state of the writers. They made it possible to create both the map and the timeline of the ongoing war through stories, through narratives, and to link the events of the war and human response to them. We will hear about our first findings from Emily Altman. Today we open the Narratives of War virtual exhibit. This work is only started. We will keep collecting testimonies. We will work on providing more context to the places, events, topics that the testimonies relate to. The stories that you will read are stories of loss and exile, of death and violence, fear and anger. But these are also narratives of hope and resilience and unwavering faith that Ukraine will prevail. It is not an easy read, but for many of us it was life-changing. We're proud to make these stories known to the world today. And I will stop here and I will now give the word to my colleagues and I will return at the end of this presentation to conclude.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kuperman. So next I have I'd like to introduce Dr. Larysa Zasiekina. She is a professor of clinical psychology and psycholinguistics and is also the vice rector for research and international affairs at Lesya, Ukrainka, Volyn National University. And currently she is a visiting scholar in the Department of Psychology at Cambridge University in the UK. And Dr. Zasiekina, please.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, from the name of Ukraine, from the name of the Ukrainian scholars and Lesya Ukrainka National University, it's now my pleasure and privilege to participate in this panel and present the results of our research. Why should we scholars, academia presented here, be interested in today's topic and in this project, collecting testimonies? The response is quite evident because this topic it essentially leads to playing our active role in the life of society and in the life of concrete people. We can translate the results of this project into society and prioritize the main fields because we hear the real voices and we hear the real needs of real people. And prioritizing of these problems is very, very important because now we could make trajectory for further researches. We call it science communication or science advice. And we could give or can give this science advice because we collected these testimonies from the first days of the war. And it's very important bridge between science and between practice. All our participants were actually co-producers of our research. They were real people who helped us to conduct this project. It's very important that this project is alive, it is not artificial. It was not grown up in the laboratory, but of course it was conducted by the laboratory. And I'm very grateful to Victor Kuperman and his wonderful teams for this great initiative connected with this project. And also we are grateful to our participants because we started collecting data at the beginning of the war, as I told, and it was terrible situation for participants. It was continuous traumatic stress. Sometimes they had to write their testimonies in shelters under the sounds of sirens or missiles. It was cold because it was winter, and then it was early spring, and it was also cold. And the Ukrainians demonstrated very strong shared resilience, and we had collected more than 1,500 testimonies from different oblasts of Ukraine. 42% of participants were forcibly displaced people, and they're mostly women. Of course, about 84% were women, and mean age about 31. Another important point that this project corresponds to the requirement of digital era. We know that only 2 mouse clicks could transport us, for example, from wonderful painting Last Supper in Milano to very terrible situation in Kakhovka. Yes, and because now it's very simple in digital era to transport from one place to another one. It's very hyperactive. And this project, it also allows us by 2 clicks of the computer mouse to be transported in very horrific situations in Ukraine. And when we read these testimonies, we could imagine visually. It's very obvious how people were suffering, and I think that this virtual format of these testimonies is very, very important because it could translate the truth about these events for many future generations and hopefully prevent the world from horrible wars in future. For me, this project is very important personally and professionally. Personally, because I was started collecting testimonies about another very terrible event and situation which is connected with the Ukrainian nation. It is the Holodomor, the genocide, which was recognized now by 32 countries. And I started to collect testimonies in 1990, and my collection of testimonies about the Holodomor was one of the first collections in the world. And I started collecting testimonies when witnesses were alive. And now I understand how it is important to collect testimonies in time when we could hear the real voices and real testimonies of real people till they are alive. Because then in many, many years we could feel the deficit or limit of these testimonies, and it could be a great barrier to know the truth for future generation. As for my from professional perspective, as clinical psychologist, I understand that the important stage of the recovery from trauma is justice. And trauma is always a social problem. And healing cannot be individual. The wounds, traumatic wounds, are always part of the social ecology. And if trauma originates in a fundamental injustice, the full recovery and repair is possible through the justice of white community. So I think that this project and virtual testimonies in 2 languages, especially in Ukrainian and language, bring us to social justice, recognizing and condemning the full invasion of Ukraine, and hopefully provide public safety in the future. I would like to thank all Canadians for the tremendous support for the Ukrainians. Thank you very much.
Dr. Maya Bullock. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Linguistics and Languages here at McMaster. And before the war, she is an assistant professor at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev, but her position was interrupted in September of 2022. So,
good evening, everyone. My name is Maya Bullock, and before February 2022, I was a lecturer at Zasiekina National University of Kiev, and my research was focused on the Ukrainian language mostly. After the Russian invasion, I was forced to flee my home, as many Ukrainians did. It was not my choice, nor was it the choice of the thousands of people. The war brought uncertainty about our future and threatened our safety. In June 2022, I was awarded a visiting scholarship from ARiEAL, which enabled me to move to Canada. Then I received a postdoctoral fellowship at McMaster University, and with this opportunity, I was able to continue my research on Ukrainian and English speech sounds of Ukrainian speakers living in Canada. The project Narratives of War is important for me, as it serves as a constant reminder that the war is not over. With each passing day, people in Ukraine are in constant danger. Even when we ourselves are safe, we are surviving the war with other Ukrainians because our families, our loved ones, and our friends remain in Ukraine. It is also my personal story because my family is still in Kyiv. With this project, we aim to share the real stories of those who have witnessed the horrors of war. Since May 2022, we have collected over 1,500 narratives from all Ukrainian regions. Tonight, we present most of the stories in our virtual exhibit. Allow me to provide some insight into the process behind the creation of this virtual exhibit. The ARiEAL team worked on this text, preparing them for the exhibition. So firstly, we clean up the text, ensuring the removal of any plagiarism and duplicates. Stories from minors were also excluded. Then we proofread the text, correcting any spelling and punctuation errors. Simultaneously, the texts were translated into English, therefore all stories are now available in both Ukrainian and English. Before publication, an essential step was taken to de-identify the text. This involved the removal of personal names, cities, and institutions, ensuring the privacy and anonymity of the individuals who shared their experiences. Two key aspects we work on with these stories. The first was data analysis, which Emily Iphone will talk about in more detail further. This analysis involves exploring the language within the text and its correlation with psychological states, allowing us to gain insights into the impact of war on mental health. And finally, the combination of our collective efforts can be shown through the virtual exhibit Narratives of War website. It is there that you will discover the powerful stories that concentrate on the strengths, resilience, and hope that define the Ukrainian people now. Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Bullock. Next, I'd like to introduce Olga Borova. Olga is a master's student in Gender and Social Justice in the Department of Gender and Social Justice here at McMaster. Her career in Ukraine was, like Dr. Bullock's, interrupted by the war. And before the war, she was a PhD candidate in philology at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. Olga.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Olga Borova, and in 2022, I was a first-year PhD student at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv, Ukraine, where I was studying Crimean Tatar language and literature. Crimean Tatar language is basically indigenous language of people of Crimea. And when Russia-Ukraine war started on February 24th, 2022, just a few days later, on the website, laboratories across the world offering their help for Ukraine, I learned about the opportunity to join ARiEAL Research Center as a visiting student, and this led to the beginning of my journey with a significant project after my arrival in Canada. I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in gender and social justice, as it was mentioned before, and where I'm working on the semantic analysis of these testimonies, specifically in women testimonies of migration and displacement. The essence of this project is not purely academical. It is also a reminder that war is not over yet, and countless individuals still influenced by its previous impact. The daily challenges that Ukrainians face are relentless shielding, frequent power outages, and unsettling ambiguity surrounding the state of nuclear power plant. This is a disheartening reality persistently etched in the minds of every Ukrainian. Indeed, there is no Ukrainian untouched by this war. For those of Ukrainians who are in the diaspora, their hearts was their homeland. Through their families, that they still there, or also, of course, the Ukrainians who left after the beginning of the war, they also have family there, and they are worried about it constantly. So everyone is constantly on the news, reading it, and being worried. For instance, my own family, my parents in particular, are in Ukraine now. Hence, the testimonies encapsulated on our website, which I will guide you through in a moment, they represent the experiences of people, of Ukrainians from diverse regions, from diverse ages and backgrounds. Now, allow me to guide you through the website. Feel free to scan this QR code if you haven't done this before. Also, you have them in the on the bookmarks. So when you open the homepage, which is basically the first thing you see, you may learn about virtual exhibit itself, and of course, it provides a user-friendly guide how to navigate the exhibit. It explains everything, but I will guide you through this as well. So after this, we can go on the About page, where you can learn about contributors to the project. Some of us that you can see here, and also you know how to contact us when you have any concerns or have some ideas or any questions. And a unique feature of our platform is the ability to browse items, which is you can browse testimonies by map, by timeline, and also you can see exhibits. For example, if you select a map, start with a map. You can select a region that you are most interested on and see all the testimonies that were written in this region. You can't see the direct places where people were writing their testimonies from, but because of privacy concerns and security, but you can access the testimony like this. Then you can see the PDF file of the testimony, and of course you can read below the testimony itself and the data that is posted about it. Here's the testimony text. Yes, all regions are comprehensively represented. Speaking of the timeline feature, you can see when testimony was collected. Just mention this one. It takes some time to show it. Also, the there is the exhibit section. Currently it has one exhibit, but we hope to add more. You can see the exhibit about Russian worship, and if you read it, you can learn about significant symbolic importance of this Russian worship story. As well as you can see the testimonies that mention it. So again, you can press and there will be a testimony. So it's very easy to navigate the website. But yes, there is a short story, both in English and Ukrainian. And the search function is another crucial element of the website. So people can search different testimonies by employing criteria that they are interested in. These criteria can be age, gender, region, occupation status of the territories, or person's education, or specific keywords. For example, if we print Kyiv, we may find some testimonies that mention Kyiv. Yes, and as it stands, Narratives of the War website is the most easily accessible by laptop, but we're working on more mobile-friendly version. Thank you for your attention and participation in this crucial event. We trust you will find this project both informative and impactful.
Thanks, Olga. This was also my first glimpse of the website, so it looks fantastic. So I'm sure there's going to be questions about it during the panel. So, but next, let me introduce Emily Altman. Emily is a master's student in cognitive science in the Department of Linguistics and Languages at McMaster, and she's going to say a few things about how she has been connecting to the Narratives of War project. Emily.
Hello everyone, my name is Emily Altman and I'm a master's student in the Cognitive Science and Language program. So when the war broke out in Ukraine, I wanted to help, and professionally that ended up coming in the form of being involved in this project. And I did want to be involved in the research collaboration that started up, but data collection was just beginning at the time. So to prepare for future analysis of the Ukrainian narratives, I have focused on my research on analyzing the language of Holocaust survivors from interviews that were conducted in the 1990s. And these interviews provide crucial testimonies of trauma and genocide that survivors went through, but the interviews were conducted around 50 years after the actual time of the collective trauma. And the immediacy of these war narratives contrasts with that. They're written as raw, emotional testimonies at the time that the genocide is occurring. And so I'm interested in to see how the language differs between being very removed from the trauma and writing while in the midst of it. And now I'm going to share some data analysis that we've been able to do on the narratives of war testimonies. So, in addition to writing the narratives, the participants that took part in the project were asked to fill out a questionnaire called the PCL-5, and it is a self-reported measure to assess symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And our visitor, Dr. Larysa Zasiekina, and her colleague, Dr. Zasiekina, and Dr. Kuperman, they recently published a paper where they were analyzing the PTSD scores of these Ukrainian participants. So they found, as you can see on the graph, that actually the majority of respondents had scores that were like above the threshold for being at risk for PTSD. So it's the red, we can see the majority of scores being higher than that, and that's definitely concerning, but and tragic, but it's not necessarily surprising. We have also been able to perform analysis on the language of the actual narratives with respect to the PTSD scores of the participants in the project. And here you can see two word clouds. So the red word cloud are words that are used more frequently and are more likely to be used by participants who scored higher on the PTSD questionnaire, and the green word cloud is corresponding to the people who scored lower and are at less risk for PTSD. And here you can see the word clouds translated into English. It's the same words, and I just want to go through a few of these words that are indicating higher and lower levels of PTSD respectively. And the size of the word is going to correspond to the likelihood of it appearing in a narrative that's either a high or a lower scoring person. So in the red on the left, we have loud. This could relate to bombs or shelling, which are also words in the red cloud. There's ruin, also very prominent. It could relate to a variety of destruction that the people are experiencing. Orc is below ruin. It's a commonly used phrase for Russian soldiers. There's in the morning, and first week in the morning is vertical. And these are corresponding to the start of the war, very likely that initial time of trauma that was so impactful for people. There's also to watch the news, stress, emotion, bomb shelter, and pain in the red words spoken by people experiencing a lot of trauma. And then in the green, these are protective words, people who have lower PTSD symptoms. We have to believe victory, maybe the most clear word here. Hope is protective. And also tomorrow, thinking into the future, and that again I think relates to hope, to lower that anxiety, to make a decision here. This was very interesting, and Dr. Zasiekina really explained this to me about how making a decision requires rationality, and rationality is very difficult to achieve from someone who's experiencing extreme anxiety, which PTSD is a type of anxiety. And so it's showing that the people who are writing about making decisions, they're going to have lower anxiety levels and are able to process their experiences and make these decisions. And to be difficult here is also very key, and to me, I thought this might recognize the hardship, but seems to be stating it in a more processed way. Again, a lower anxiety. And we also have to be Ukraine here, and nation. And these are showing that importance of protection of national identity and hope. And the last thing I want to mention is that in the green, there's a couple connection words. We have like friend, family, wife, son, so people's connections are helping them cope with the war, but also we have the word father in the red. And I thought that this could be because of conscription and the martial law and the pain that can come to people from that. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
That's really terrific, Emily. I think your kind of glimpse into how we can make use of this for research purposes is fantastic. Last, but certainly not least, is a friend and colleague, Myron Groover. Myron is the Archives and Rare Books Librarian at McMaster, and he's an adjunct associate professor in the Department of History, also at McMaster. And I have to confess, Myron helps me a lot when I teach my sociology course in historical methods in sociology, and he is fantastic in terms of bringing archives alive to students. So Myron, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm the last panelist, which is a challenging position, so I'm going to keep my remarks as brief as I can. I come from a perspective of someone who thinks about memory, who thinks about identity, who thinks about storytelling in the long term. So I come from a methodological and scholarly tradition that is concerned with the preservation and transmission forward through time of human stories in scales not of months or years, but of decades, of centuries. Thinking about how we project our stories and our sense of self and our sense of shared identity, trauma, justice, injustice forward through time. Like many of my co-panelists, when the war began, I was convulsed by a sense of moral revulsion, paralysis, helplessness almost. And so being able to be a part of this project has, like I think for many of us, provided somewhere hopefully constructive to place some of these feelings and energies. When the project team first reached out to me last year, they expressed an interest in building a virtual exhibit, a virtual platform for displaying these testimonies, these records. And I immediately started thinking, these aren't just testimonies, they're not just records, these are documents, these are people's stories, these are the kinds of things that archivists deal with every day. And this is an example of a body of archival information that doesn't need to be brought alive. The life of this testimony database is in the testimonies themselves. So all we had to do is build a platform that could bring them to people so that we could really bring home and emphasize something that a number of my colleagues have spoken about, which is letting people speak in their own words at a time of immediacy about what is happening in Ukraine. So the challenge, as I saw it when I was invited to join this project, was we have data. We have data that's been collected electronically. It's been collected in formats which may not be stable over periods of decades, of centuries. A piece of paper is great, actually, because as long as it's made before the year 1800, to be really nerdy, it's going to last essentially forever, as long as it's in good condition. Think of something like a tweet or a digital response or a spreadsheet. I think we've all had the experience of opening a Word document on a different computer than we wrote it on, and it looks completely different. What you're encountering there is a digital preservation problem in action. So we had a challenge of how to project forward through time these testimonies, these over 1,000 testimonies that have been collected during this moment of intense trauma. And the perspective that I brought to this was one that's really from my methodological tradition in archives. And the tradition of archives, and this is something that I think bears emphasizing in this moment in particular, the tradition of archives comes from the practice of law. It comes from jurisprudence. It comes from the stewardship of evidence. It comes from concerns about accountability, truth-telling, what we can trust, what the custody is of documents and how that affects their transmission. So there's a legal context here where archives and testimonies like this actually provide us evidence, not just of trauma, of suffering, but of crimes against humanity, against nationhood, against personhood. So on one hand, archives are in a juridical context, but there's also the social context of storytelling, of creating shared identity through shared meaning, through language. Some of my colleagues have talked about the exhibits that we are building from these testimonies, a way of telling further stories with testimonies. So pulling something together like the Russian warship incident at Snake Island, along with testimonies of people that spoke about that very thing, as a way of adding further context to these stories. Some of the problems that we faced in trying to greet this challenge of projecting these electronic records forward through time, problems of instability. These are records that are being collected in an active conflict zone. In a country that's being invaded by, let's say, an enemy that is not unaccustomed to information warfare. So we have a situation where we have very ephemeral testimonies that we need to project forward through time at a period of intense violence and shared trauma. And the challenge then becomes not only how do we collect this data, but how do we preserve it? How do we transmit it forward through time? So some of the strategies that we've adopted as a project team to try and ensure the longevity of these testimonies have been around thinking about redundancy. Can we keep copies of these in different places so that if one node goes down, there are still other nodes? Think about things like resilience. Maybe we need to preserve testimonies, which we are doing, in a plurality of formats. So not just the initial project inputs, but how can we generate stable outputs that we can project forward through time? In all of this, we've kind of been animated by a philosophy that my colleagues in archives like to refer to as LOCKS, which is a very crude acronym that you could remember in your own personal lives, which means lots of copies, keep stuff safe. So we've tried to think about redundancy, about geo-remote location. There's a bunch of boring lore behind the scenes here about geo-remote storage of this data, but suffice to say we are doing everything we possibly can to ensure not only the integrity and immediacy of these stories, but also their survival for future generations. I'll close there, and let me just say Slava Ukraini.
Myron, Slava.
Now that you've heard from all panelists, I think you have a better appreciation of the scope of the project and the work involved in making the virtual exhibit live. So it is my pleasure now to thank everyone who contributed to this project in many capacities, by setting up the study, by collecting the data, processing it, editing and translating the texts, designing the website and putting it together, so and many other uses to which the expertise and the time of our team was instrumental. All of this was done on a voluntary basis, I must add, by people generously sharing their time and expertise carved out of their busy schedules. So, in alphabetic order, let me thank Emily Altman, Dr. Mike Bula, Olga Dvorova, Brianna Griska-McPhee, Myron Grover, Maria Hrintis, Alexander Jackson, Nadia Lana, Alana Meyer, Kira Kuperman, Dr. Satzewich, Daria Perebi, Dr. Zasiekina, and Dr. Larysa Zasiekina. So let's give them the applause. We also thank the McMaster International Initiatives Microfund, which made possible the visit of our colleague, Dr. Larysa Zasiekina, today. Thanks are also due to McMaster University Library, Office of International Affairs, Alumni and Advancement for their support in funding and organizing this event. Finally, our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Max Degenet for coordination and administrative support. There's one last point that I wanted to make, and for this I have to go back to the story about the early days of the war. When my colleagues and I advertised our labs on the list of of groups that accept Ukrainian scholars, we received over 40 applications. This was probably close to more than 100 people if you count the families and so on. We were ultimately able to host 4 professors and scholars with the generous help of several McMaster support programs and funding from federal granting agencies. Our new colleagues and friends have already made a tremendous contribution to research, teaching, and community life that is hard to miss, including, of course, this project. But I cannot help thinking about so many others that we could not support at the time. In Ukraine, countless scholars and students have been displaced and their lives disrupted by the devastating conflict. We have an opportunity here and now to make a difference in their lives. To date, I invite you to consider donating in any way you can and extend a helping hand to the individuals who are striving to continue their education and rebuild their future. If you'd like to learn more about how you can support this cause, please feel free to connect with the individuals listed on this slide or any of the event organizers. Thank you for being here this evening and for your generous consideration in supporting this work.